there's a lot of potential for movement ecology here in Australia, and I think we have some fascinating systems also to study. But I'm actually going to take us to Africa. And I'm going to talk today a bit about the ecology of collective movements, but also a little bit about individual movements. And so as I sort of introduced myself last month, in the first inaugural meeting of this group, I kind of came to movement ecology. Well, I didn't plan to become a movement ecologist because my core interest is really in social behavior and understanding social behavior. And when you think about social behavior, we can think about questions about social behavior. A lot of people ask questions about social evolution. Why do animal or humans form groups? I'm kind of more interested in the consequences of social behavior in the sense of like, when they do form groups, how then do they solve many of the ecological challenges that they face as groups, or the new challenges that they face when living in groups. So for example, we know that group living is widespread in the animal kingdom, but each of these animal groups have to face challenges like coordinating their behaviors. They have to maintain cohesion. They have to reach consensus about what to do next, right, in order to stay as a group. And they have to do all of this despite a lot of heterogeneity among group members. And so I want to take you to Africa. This is the Laikipia Plateau. And this is where I really set out to try and answer some of these questions when I started my first job as a group leader at the Max Planck, and then took that to Switzerland, and then now here to Australia. And specifically in 2016, I established a study on these majestic birds. This is the vulturine guineafowl. Vulturine guineafowl endemic to East Africa. They're a semi-arid adapted bird. And what drew me to these birds, I had initially gone to Kenya to work on baboons, but baboons were really hard and also very sort of spread out. And what really drew me about these birds is the incredibly sort of collective behavior that they show. So they move in these very tight-knit social groups. They're also really striking, and they're also terrestrial, so they're easy to study in 2 dimensions, but then they're also quite large, and so we can potentially use them to fit some good biologgers onto them. And so this is the first bird that we caught in 2016, and it was quite a lot of trials and effort to try and figure out how to catch them, but eventually my team, especially rather my team than myself, we sort of nailed down the process. This is an early prototype of a walk-in trap, but the idea is the same, that we have these traps, and the good thing about these birds is we can trap the entire group at once. And this is actually one of the study groups that I'll focus on the most. This is the wing tags group. And again, the reason I sort of went out to work on these birds is because once we catch the birds, we could fit them with color bands, so we can individually identify birds as opposed to having to learn to recognize them. But most importantly, they were big. They were about 1.5 to 1.8 kilos, which allows us to put some decent biologgers on. And so you can see this bird is carrying a solar-powered GPS tag. And these tags actually collect a huge amount of data because the solar is so good in Kenya. It's high altitude, the air is clear, and the tags sit really well on these birds. And so we've collected a massive data set across the hundreds of birds that we've tagged. Let me start with the studies like this. So what we did is in the group that I'll show you this photo of, we took every individual and tagged every bird with a GPS tag in this group. And here you can see, this video never quite goes to the end. You can see a situation where the group has a conflict of interest. I'm just moving manually, and different group members want to go in different directions. And this is effectively the kind of situation that I set out to study initially, right? How do they reach consensus? How do they coordinate their behaviors? And how do they deal with this heterogeneity in their preferences among group members and remain as a group? So what we have here is we have part of the group that want to continue in the original direction of travel, which is in this movement direction like this, and some members of the group that seem to have wanted to take a right turn and go down in this direction. Now we can turn to theory to get some answers to make some predictions about what might happen. And then particularly this paper by Ian Cousin from 2005 in Nature, where he simulated these kinds of decision using agent-based models. And he found that the resulting behavior, so the direction taken by the group, it depends a bit on the angle in the differences between the directions of the preferences. Okay, so on the left, we have basically everyone wants to go in the same direction. on the right, we have something more like this, where they want to go in opposite directions. And what he found is that at small angles, the group effectively sort of splits a difference. They go kind of down the middle, and then you get to some critical angle where they choose one direction versus the other. This is exactly what we see here. We see that these birds here effectively give up, and if this video plays properly, they will continue, rejoin the group, and then the group will actually continue to travel in the original direction of movement, which you can see if I do the video properly here. And so this, in this particular case, we see the movement of the birds following exactly the prediction. But this is just one occurrence of this. And of course, like in observational methods, it's really difficult to build up a sort of sample size to be able to replicate this. So this is where the biologging comes in, because we had these birds tagged with GPS tags for several years, we could get hundreds and thousands of these kinds of cases and extract them automatically from the data set. And then we could, oops, it goes again, and we could look at what this pattern looks like over all of these decisions. And it looks effectively exactly like what the theory predicted. So you have this statistically unimodal section at low angle, at low differences in angle. There's a bit of a transition period where statistically we can't tease apart between these modes, and then, which is like this period here on the left one, and then you have a statistically significant bimodal pattern where the group either goes in one direction versus the other. And what I think is really neat about this result is that we had previously done the same thing with baboons, and in baboons we saw exactly the same thing. So here we have two systems that have quite similar sort of social structures. Let's say they have similar, they both live in large groups and they live in the same habitat, and they seem to be resolving these conflicts of interest in much the same way. Now you can also ask which of the two directions the group might take. So whether they go in the top direction or the bottom direction. And what we find is that what predicts that is the numerical difference between the two potential directions, or the two sort of sets of individuals that want to go in different directions. So a subgroup like this one that is a numerical majority, so on this side, and the group is disproportionately likely to go in that direction versus the other direction. And it's effectively basically a majority rule. It's exactly what we would expect, and it's also exactly what baboons do. But let's go back a little bit to movement and think about these questions also, because what we observe a lot in these species, but also more broadly across a number of species, is that not everyone engages in all the decisions, and some individuals tend to engage more often than others. And so we can ask the question also about leadership, and specifically, we know that leadership is beneficial because you effectively, if you're successful in being a leader, you get to do what you want to do. But what we don't know so much about is whether there are some costs involved in leading. And maybe this might explain why some individuals try more often than others, because there's a trade-off, and individuals respond to that trade-off in slightly different ways. And so we set out to ask this by implanting some of the birds in this group with heart rate loggers. So we had about half the group which were implanted heart rate loggers, and this gave us a signal of the electrical pulses going through, produced by the heart at 180 hertz. And importantly, because we did this on multiple individuals at the same time, we could see which individuals had a high heart rate and which individuals had a lower heart rate. And so we could study, again, a situation like this, but this time we could overlay the heart rate experienced by each of the individuals involved. And what we were particularly interested in is asking about the degree of conflict that was experienced among the group, and if that has an impact on the heart rate and where these individuals are in relation to that conflict. So we can talk about conflict in two different ways. In the y-axis here, you have the directional agreement at the top or disagreement at the bottom. So this is kind of like the x-axis of the previous model. It's the difference in the angles between these two directions. So at the top, they want to go in the same direction. At the bottom, they want to go in opposite directions. And along the x-axis, we have the potential number of follows, which is effectively on the left-hand side is more like this, where they're the majority of the group members that want to go in the same direction. And on the right side, a subset of those individuals are really trying to go against a majority. So like these two individuals here, they have a lot of potential followers. These guys only have 2 potential followers. And when we look at the heart rate and how that looks over that, what we see is that the degree of conflict and the interaction in the conflict between these two dimensions has a really big impact on the heart rate being experienced by individuals. So that the bigger the angle, and especially for those individuals that are in the minority, they're the ones that experience a high heart rate. Now, there's not, this is quite extreme, and there's not so much data here because guineafowl tend to be quite aligned, so most of the time they tend to agree. But even if you look at sort of halfway along here, we're still seeing a corrected heart rate change of about 50 beats per minute, which is quite a large change. It's much larger. It's like the equivalent of, or it's more than the equivalent of a bird going from standing still and running really fast, pretty much as fast as they go. So it's quite a big effect size. And so, these studies together have kind of sort of highlight one dimension of movement and kind of the ecology of collective movement in some sense, which is that, they obviously the birds are getting some benefits to living in these groups, and I'll come back to that a little bit at the end of the talk. But leadership or being involved in the sort of process of making decisions also seems to incur some costs for the individuals. Now, I didn't want to talk too all about this kind of collective movement, because I also wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit more about the work that we've done at the broader landscape and movements across this landscape, both by individuals and by groups. Now, one of the things that, one of the strengths of this guineafowl study is that we typically have a lot of loggers out at the same time. So here you'll see just one day of data, and each of these points is one tagged bird, and they're colored by groups. And at any one time, we have anywhere between 100 or maybe 80 and 150 birds carrying GPS tags. So this gives us a huge, not only breadth of data, but a huge depth of data. They also collect data at really high resolution as well. And you can see lots of interesting patterns about how these groups move. They move together, they merge, they sleep together in communal roosts. And effectively, sort of from these data, we're able to detect that these birds live in a multi-level society. So the groups are largely stable. The group members all stay together and move together. In harsh conditions, they'll join up with other groups for some periods of time. I'll come back to this a little bit later. But most of the time, the groups move. The groups are always moving together. And the exception to that is when some individual group members disperse to other groups. And so I want to first talk a little bit about this process of dispersal. And this was a topic of the PhD of James Irby, who's one of the people who followed me here to Australia. And James was particularly interested in the process of dispersal and the costs that are borne through the movement or the movement costs that are incurred from dispersal. So here you see one bird in the purple is always the sort of pre-departure stage of that bird. So this is its home range. This is the entire home range it experienced over its entire life as it moved around with its natal group. And at some point one morning, first thing in the morning, it decides to leave the group, walks pretty much a straight line straight out of its previous home range and traverses the landscape for some time until it sort of encounters or decides that it might be a good place to try and enter some groups, and then joins a few groups over some period of time until eventually it settles into a new group and then establishes itself in a settled home range. And if we go to the the Bible, the big review by Bonte on the cost of dispersal, there's this question that arises, or this assumption, which is that the transfer costs of making these large movements are likely to be quite significant, right? Because moving further, or movement distances are larger during the transfer than for other movements, and this is likely to incur some costs. And so one of the chapters of James's PhD was to ask whether, simply whether moving twice as far, for example, would incur twice the costs. Now, what's super neat about working on guineafowl, beside the fact that they're just excellent birds, is that they're also a model system for physiology. And so people, not us, lots of other people, have taken guineafowl in captivity, and they've put them on treadmills, and they've walked them at different speeds on these treadmills at different inclinations and things like that. They've measured the energetic use or the energy used by those birds while they're doing that. And from this, we can get a curve that captures the cost of transport, which is basically the cost that it takes for one individual to move a specific distance. And this cost of transport changes with speed. And effectively, what happens is that the cost of transport goes down as speed goes up. And this is because although individuals are expressing more energy, they're using more energy per unit, as they go faster, the time savings that they're gaining by going faster outweigh the increase of energy costs. And so they're effectively more efficient. And so we can make a prediction that if they go faster, then they should be more efficient in their movement. We can also look at other aspects from the GPS tag, such as, for example, the tortuosity of the track, right? Because, of course, if you move in a more tortuous way, you're covering more ground to make some kind of net displacement, and so you will use more energy. If you move straighter, then you would use less energy. And so we made some predictions that what we should see in these dispersing guineafowls, that they should move faster and they should move straighter in order to be more energy efficient and offset some of the costs. And this is what we see. So we see that in these light teal color, here's the difference in the daily track length. And so they move about a third further each day. And actually, for the core period of movement, it's actually a larger increase than that. This also includes days of local movements as before they settled into groups. But despite this, still a significant increase. And importantly, they do this much faster. So there's about a third increase almost in speed. And they move much straighter than they do during other movements. And so these changes combine, and we could combine this with the physiological data to actually gain an estimate of the changes in net displacement costs. And we see that there's actually a reduction, quite a quarter reduction in the net displacement cost during the transience periods when they're making these big movements relative to the other types of movements. And all this results in a difference in the daily cost of transport during transients being only marginally larger than they express during their normal movements. So effectively what we find is that birds can move like a third further every day with only about a 4% increase in the energetic expenditure expressed with that movement. Now, there are, of course, other costs, right? They might forego foraging and things like that. This is just the cost of movement. But I think it's important because it makes us question some of the assumptions, such as whether going twice as far is actually twice the cost, and highlights that there are actually some strategies, some movement strategies that animals can express to help mitigate those costs. And we know this from birds, for example, in migration. Migratory birds have different wings than non-migratory birds, and that's sort of an adaptation to migration. And these kinds of movement behaviors are also likely to be adaptations to reducing the cost of movement. Now, James, together with Tullio, also asked a little bit about some of the interfaces with the environment, right? So how does the environment then also translate to some of these costs? And specifically, we were interested to ask whether birds might also be managing these larger speeds or these higher speeds by being selective in terms of where they're moving in the landscape. And so Tullio went out to Kenya and he measured all the roads and all the water bodies and built rasters of habitat cover and all these things, and then implemented a step selection analysis so you could ask how different predictors in terms of environmental features would affect where the birds move, and also took segments of high resolution 1 Hertz GPS data from which he could also estimate the cost of transport from segments within habitat types. And what he found is that, what him and James found is that dispersing birds tend to select for open areas, specifically glades, which are like open grassy areas, but especially roads. And they had much stronger selection for these features than selection shown by residents, because we could compare this by also applying the same step selection framework to resident birds, so birds that are not migrating, not dispersing. And what's really important is that we could link this then to the cost of transport. And what we found, or what they found, is that roads are actually the most efficient form of transportation. So birds use about a third less energy when they're walking along roads than they are along any of the other habitat types that exist. And we could break this down further and really show that it's coming because they're able to not only are roads straighter, because roads are basically designed to traverse habitat, but also the birds are walking faster when they're walking along roads than on different habitat types. And so the summary of this is that effectively we've shown that guineafowl exhibit a suite of highly efficient behaviors when dispersing, when changing both how and when they move. I didn't talk about the when, but also where they move. It helps them mitigate some of the costs associated with dispersing. So that's at the individual level, but what about at groups? Are groups also able to express some of these same types of behaviors or not? And what we see in the vulturine guineafowl is we see groups often making large nomadic movements as well. And so this is two sets of home ranges. So they do this often as large groups. Okay, so what we have here is 3 blue groups and 3 red groups, and the sort of polygons are their previous home ranges. And at some point during the drought that we had a couple of years ago, which I'll come to in a second, these birds made some large excursions in search of resources. And the dispersing bird that I showed you before actually dispersed out to this area over here. And so what we see is a very sort of complementary type of movement expressed by actually move to this area here. So a sort of even larger movement by groups than what the individual dispersers were doing. Now, thinking back to the first part of my talk, I showed you this kind of example of the fact that the group had a conflict of interest about where to go. And one consequence of this is that the group actually stopped temporarily and then started again. And so we can make the prediction that this kind of conflicts of interest might actually slow the group down and make it more challenging for them to be more efficient. And so James, in this recent paper published this year, compared this sort of long distance displacement movements by collectives or groups, compared them to the properties of them to the properties expressed by solitary movers. I should mention that these are individuals in groups, right? So it's always comparing individuals to individuals, but in the group context and the solitary context. And again, he applied the same framework of quantifying the cost of transport based, I should have mentioned before, it's based on the 1 Hertz GPS data, which allows us to calculate speed quite accurately, so 1 point every second. And what he found is when the birds are making these big movements, that groups are actually not able to be as efficient as solitary movers, or individuals that move in a group are less efficient than individuals that move alone. They are actually more efficient than they would be if they were just doing local ranging. I didn't show that result, but their energy gain of through the sort of strategic movement, like what I talked about before, is not as high as what solitary individuals are able to achieve. And again, breaking this down, what we find is that groups are just as capable of making straight movement. In fact, they're a little bit straighter than dispersers. These are the groups in the pink, but they're much slower, so they can't achieve the same increases in speed to what solitary individuals can achieve. So what does this all mean? Like, why then are birds forming in groups, given the fact that we've shown, as I've shown, sorry, this is a group of birds. Why do they form these groups? Given the fact that there's costs associated with being in a collective in terms of making collective decisions, but also costs in terms of the cost of transport. So as I sort of hinted at before, we've during the course of this study, so this is data from 2018, which is when really we wrapped up the population and the GPS tagging. This population experiences what is pretty classical in terms of a tropical semi-arid environment. So that I studied these guys almost on the equator. It's like 0.02 degrees north, which is that the environment is sort of experiences very cyclical periods of dry and wet, and that's actually usually two wet periods and 2 quite dry periods each year. So you get a rainy season, and then it gets very wet, and then you get almost no rain for a few months, it goes dry, and a wet rainy season, and then a dry period, and cycle like that. And so this kind of cycling is quite normal. But what happened in 2021, for a couple of years, we effectively had a number of failed wet seasons in a row, about 4 or 5 failed wet seasons in a row, all the way until 2023. So we had this period of quite major drought. And this was declared one of the worst droughts in a century for East Africa. So the landscape in this environment went from looking like this. This is 2019, beautiful, like a little paradise, to a number of years where the environment looked like this. And I really feel a lot for my team who had to live in this place, in this dry dust bowl for a bunch of years working on this system. So we wanted to find out a little bit more about the consequences of these droughts on the individuals. And so, as well as collecting GPS data, at this time we also switched on the accelerometer on the GPS tag. So we hadn't run the accelerometer before because we collect so much GPS data that it's a real burden to download everything. And the accelerometer data is even more data to download. But here we thought it was warranted. So we downloaded GPS, we downloaded accelerometer data, and then using machine learning, we could classify the different behaviors. This is now pretty well established. You could classify when they're walking and preening and pecking and so on. And we really focused on this pecking behavior because this is a measure of foraging effort. And we looked at the foraging effort from the, I think it's about 49 birds that had accelerometer data, and how this foraging effort, the proportion of time spent foraging, changed with resource conditions, or with the increasing resource scarcity. And so here we have I should have illustrated this second, but let's focus on left. We have the change in foraging activity as resources become scarcer, which we measured resource scarcity with NDVI. And you can see a very strong increase in feeding and foraging activity. So there's less food available, and so the birds are spending more time trying to get food. Also, probably the quality of the food has gone down. What we also see is actually that body weight is decreasing over this period. So it seems that this compensatory foraging is not actually achieving, or is not allowing them to maintain body condition through the drought. So they were dropping in body condition. And one reason for this is likely that birds face a trade-off, right? So a lot of the food that they feed on is in these open areas. This is where the food tends to be found, in the open grassy areas. But temperatures, within the dry period, get the thermal exposure is much higher. And so we typically see them, trying to avoid being in the sun as much as possible. This is a nice illustrative picture of that. So we could quantify this a bit explicitly. So some of the birds that had heart rate loggers, or all the birds that had heart rate loggers, also had thermal body temperature, internal body temperature. And we also put out operative temperature loggers throughout the landscape, both in the open and in the shade. But here we focus on the exposed ones. And so we could relate the operative temperature to the body temperature. And we found this quadratic sort of relationship. This tells us that at some point in external operative temperature, the birds are having to engage in thermal homeostasis maintenance behaviors. And so their internal body, even though the endotherms, the body temperature goes up as it gets hotter outside, at some point that increase stops. And this is likely because the birds are having to invest in maintaining body temperature at safe levels as opposed to doing other activities. And so we use this cutoff, and we try to have a look at how this cutoff relates to environmental conditions and how it relates to resource scarcity, like what I showed you before. And we can see that the proportion of the day here in which exceed this thermal threshold, or this high risk threshold, goes up as drought, as it gets drier and drier and drier. And so this sort of lack of thermal compensation in foraging is not just probably because there's not enough food, but because birds are also experiencing a stronger trade-off with thermal risk as well. And so what does this all sum up to? Well, what we see is that the combination of heat and lack of food and lack of cover means that we see a drop in the sort of survival rate. This is the monthly survival probability of birds during drought relative to other seasonal conditions. And what's interesting is that this is also the period in which we see birds forming these large groups. So these vulturine guineafowl live in this multi-level society where groups join with other groups. And we see this happening really as it starts to dry in the environment. And this is also when they make these very large movements in search of food. And so what we think is that this is likely to be a sort of survival mechanism to allow them to benefit from a lot of the collective benefits like safety from predators, and so on as the conditions become really harsh. And we can link this aspect to also their survival, and we can look at basically how survival relates to group size, and there's a bit of an effect, but it's not really significant in non-drought conditions. But when it's drought conditions, we suddenly start to see a big drop in survival for those individuals that are living in smaller groups, whereas it's only the individuals living in larger groups that are able to maintain a higher survival. And so putting the second part of the talk all together really highlights the flip side of the costs, which is the benefits, which is that when conditions become harsh, birds are facing harsher trade-offs. So they're having to forage harder, and then this likely puts them at more risk of predation and things like that. And so they draw in larger groups. Oh yeah, I should have also skipped the slide, but we also see that the foraging effort is much higher. The increase in foraging effort is much higher for smaller groups than larger groups, which might also explain some of this survival buffer as well. And so that's pretty much it from me. So you can see I sort of tackled a bit of movement and a bit of other collective and social behaviors, which is effectively describes what we do in my lab these days mostly. And so just some take-home messages. I think what I hope the study really illustrates is the strength, especially of biologging. And when we combine biologging that allows us to get second-by-second behaviors and physiological data with some longer-term monitoring where we can see how the sort of costs and benefits are changing across the different seasonal conditions or the different challenges that individuals are experiencing. And also, of course, highlighting that living in groups introduces many novel costs, right? So the costs associated with collective decision-making don't exist for solitary individuals. But also that these costs that the individuals are paying might play out at different time periods or different timescales to the benefits that they might be experiencing as well, hence the need for this kind of longer term perspective. Now, all this work, of course, was done by a large team of people, and specifically thanks to James, who led most of the movement studies, and Brenna, who's our field manager for a number of years, and now Kennedy, who's our current field manager, keeping the project going, and Hania, and Charlotte, who also played a big part in most of the studies that I spoke about today. Of course, lots of funding that made this available, and especially, I'm incredibly fortunate to have received an ERC grant that allowed us to spend 5 years investigating these questions with, a depth of funding that is, not so easily achievable these days. And thank you all for your time, and I'll be happy to receive any questions. Let me stop sharing, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. That was amazing. Yeah, really
fascinating. Sorry, I was worried about time, but it looks like
plenty of time, and plenty of time for questions. Yeah, a lot of really interesting stuff there. Who wants to kick off a question? Yeah, Mitch. Yeah.
Thank you, Damien. That was fascinating talk. A great seminar to kick off the MoveSIN seminar series. I just had a question about the foraging effort, the last little thing you talked about, and I was super interested, in that foraging effort went down with larger group sizes, and just I guess maybe a little bit more info about that. It's found it super interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't dug into that result, and actually, you can see that I was only stuck in there because it was still in that slide. I have lost even the slide since I made this talk a while ago, or part of this talk. It's definitely something we need to dig into some more. I think probably it's related. They have quite front-facing eyes. I haven't been able to quantify this because the guy in the zoo in Germany that have guineafowl are not replying to me. But I really want to sort of get this information. But I think so that it increases the trade-off between looking out for predators and searching for prey on the ground. And so I suspect in larger groups, they're able to spend more time facing down, and so they're probably more effective in their pecks than in smaller groups. That's my guess. It's also possibly that they're benefiting much more from like the collective intelligence, and so they're probably able to find patches that have maybe more food, and or the benefits in terms of risk that they're getting, that may be able to forage out more in the open than the smaller groups. So there's some of these things are likely to be together, sort of forming that result.
Cool, that's fascinating. Thanks.
I had a question about like when they do those big solitary movements, did you have any heart rate loggers on those? I'm just interested whether they undergo like a higher like stress cost through like perceived predation pressure, or whether there's also a trade-off there as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, no, not solitary. The group, so we actually wanted to target 2 groups, but all this happened in 2021, like middle of COVID, literally, we had to leave just at the end of this, when we just finished, we had to leave because they were shutting down parts of Kenya because of COVID and all that. This happened in 2021. And it also was at the onset of this drought. And so so one of the groups, it didn't really work because they had already joined up with another group. But we do have some data from that one group where it worked really well, because they did move actually to different areas during that period. But we haven't analyzed that very much. We haven't looked in detail at what happens when they're making these bigger movements versus not. It's something we should do. But yeah, there's always a million things you can do with such a big data set.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I want to say that it's like pretty cool. I mean, I feel incredibly fortunate. It was really hard work on the team. It was really hard on the team, quite stressful work, and really hard data to analyze. But combining these different perspectives, like what's happening within the individual and getting information more on the sort of how it's interfacing with the environment, I think is something we should be doing a lot more of, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, Lily.
Hi, Damien. I'm sorry, my camera's off. I am in the car. But I've actually got a question that's potentially a little bit more kind of researchy rather than about movement ecology per se. But you kind of flagged at the end, you had this big ERC grant. And you kind of said, which might not be possible today. And I am curious as to your perspective, like for people who might be more early career, trying to get funding for studies where obviously tags are very expensive. Do you have any advice? Do you have any insight to kind of how you've navigated the process in the past and the sorts of things that you think are likely to be seen as fundable, or directions to look for funding for this sort of research? Because there is often this really high initial outlay that's hard to get.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to talk about that in a broader forum as well. My very first grant was a £6,000 grant from the Association for the Study of Animal Behaviour that bought the first 5 GPS tags and my ticket to go to Kenya. And that was in end of 2016. And, that was really fundamental because we showed that we could do it, and we showed that the quality of the data that we could obtain. My next grant a year later was from Daimler-Benz Foundation, basically from Karl Benz's foundation in Germany, which funds a couple postdoc grants every year. And, I basically got money there for another 20 tags. Right? And then I started analyzing these data and looking at, movement and social dynamics and so on, and I demonstrated the capacity of the system and my own capacity in working on that system. And I think that was really fundamental in getting the ERC grant. So, my ERC grant was like a third of the grant's content was just pilot data. So I could really show that I was on this track to doing this. And I think that's a really important part. So, the big results are produced by the big grants, but all along the way, it was actually really made possible by quite small grants, actually. So you just have to sort of
thank you.
find, I don't have, it's not really helpful advice, but actually, getting the pilot data and having that vision is really what's needed.
Yeah, no, I think the comment about scalability is actually really important. So thanks.
Thanks
For joining us from the car, Lily. Jack, you had a question?
Hey, Damien, that was a really good talk. That was really interesting. I just had a quick question about right near the start when you had the group that was thinking about splitting, but then ended up choosing the same direction. You mentioned that before they split or decide on the route to go, they almost follow an average between the two directions. And I was curious if you'd quantified the cost of that middle ground without splitting and how that compares to a direct route.
Yeah, interesting. We haven't quantified it per se, but I could speak a little bit about it, because in the sort of study of collective behavior, often when you take the average of things, it actually gives you a benefit rather than a cost. So, for example, if you're trying to all estimate some goal, like if you're a bunch of pigeons flying home and you're trying to know where the loft is, and so on, if you take the average of all individuals' directions, and that average is more likely to be close to the true needed direction than any or than the majority of the individual estimates themselves. And so it's likely to actually be beneficial for them to take this sort of averaging. But the thing is, like, at some point, if the directions are too far apart, then actually it might flip into being a cost. The reason is because the average might then no longer be going anywhere near anything relevant, right? So if you have two completely different directions, it could be that group members are actually wanting to go to two different targets, right? So if the average direction, if the differences are relatively small, then they might be they're all estimating the same target a little bit differently. But if the directions are 180 degrees apart, then it's unlikely that they're trying to go to the same place, and it could be that they're going to different places, in which case you have to go to one or the other, and going to an average is going to get you nowhere.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
I was interested, Damien, this is kind of a two-part question. So I guess how has the tracking technology changed since when you started, and I guess what has that enabled you to do? And then I guess like you have really high frequency data, which is probably less common, particularly to what I've seen. I'm used to working with like 1 hour data, that kind of thing, where you can't answer these fine scale questions. And so I guess, yeah, a lot of these questions are enabled by that really fine scale data. But yeah, what other kind of questions do you think you can answer with your data?
Yeah, I mean, I find it blows my mind, because I talk to like the people who track elephants and things, and these are huge animals, and they're only getting 1 point an hour. And on our 1 kilogram, 1.5 kilogram birds, we getting, a third of the time we can get 1 hertz data from them. So the solar is a really important part. Kenya is really easy for that, because we get really good solar, but also it's like a really fixed day length, right? So every day it starts at 6 a.m. and every day it finishes at 7 p.m. So the tags are never on when it's dark. We can basically set them on exactly when they start to get solar power. I still use exactly the same tag now as what I was first used in 2016. I use EOBS tags. They're really robust. They're very simple. The ones that are the specific model I use is very simple. It just gives us triaxial accelerometer data and GPS. There's some downsides. You can't collect GPS at the same time as accelerometer. So when the GPS turns on, it turns off the accelerometer, which is annoying. Then new tags are going to overcome that limitation now. We've also tested some different tags that they have like magnometer and all this other stuff, but we've never really actually found a use for it, because even when we put all of that into the data, into the machine learning for behavioral classification, it doesn't really change the performance of the model. The accelerometer alone does fine. So I think it's changing, but I would be always, rather than adding more things, because there's also download costs. So I should add, we use these tags because we download by VHF, because there was no GSM signal for a long time at my field site. It's only recently we have GSM, but also VHF is much cheaper battery-wise, right? GSM is quite expensive to transmit. And so we also help the tag performance by spending less on transmission of the data. But yeah, I mean, if you're ever thinking about designing tags and deciding what to do and so on, like really think about transmission costs. And like we can't max out ACC and GPS. We have to really, if we're using ACC, accelerometer, then we have to we can't do 1 Hertz GPS anymore. We turn that off. Both because of the extra download costs, but also because the tag is on all the time. And so, think really carefully about what question and what you're trying to maximize, and focus, and I would always focus on trying to get as much GPS as possible, because that's really the precision of the questions that you can answer with finer scale GPS data is so much better than anything else. So I think every 5 minutes, which is what we collect. And actually, we collect 10 points every 5 minutes. We have a burst of 10 points because the resolution, the error goes down. So when your GPS turns on, it's looking for satellites. And we actually have a paper which we quantify all this. And it's looking for satellites. And then the tags that save battery, they actually switch on a little bit earlier than when they have perfect satellite data. So there's higher error. And if we collect a burst of 10 points, by the time it gets to the 10th one, it's picked up more satellites and gives us a more precise point. Sorry, I could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah, cool, thanks. I saw Duncan had your hand up, but maybe you've put it down. Did you still want to ask a question? Or?
I actually had thank you very much, Damien. I actually had a similar question to what Scott was asking, which was about the frequency of those fixes, because most people don't have 1 Hertz kind of data. Have you explored the ways of trying to optimize questions versus frequency of data hits? Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, we've got a couple of methods papers, one from the guineafowl team and one from a team that from a student that visited my lab for a while that was more focused on tracking deer, where we look at this sort of trade-off between maximizing sampling frequency, maximizing sampling length, and also thinking about deployment intensity and so on. There's not one size fits all. Basically it comes down to what you're trying to optimize in your study and what you need to optimize to answer your questions. So I don't really have one answer to give you, but I would say I'm happy to chat to people if they ever are facing this kind of challenge.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, one thing I would say is you can definitely think about how much you want to be sampling across the whole day versus sampling parts of the day, for example, if you're really trying to get data on movement. So for example, the ACC, what I didn't say is the accelerometer data that we collected from 6:30 in the morning till 11:30 in the morning, because we want to sort of cover that period as the day gets hot and so on. And then they spend 4 hours doing nothing in the middle of the day, right? So we'd just be wasting batteries collecting data during that time.
Gabriella? Oops, sorry.
Hi, thanks, Damien. That was really interesting. You've pretty much just brought up every single question I had all in one go. That was really cool. My question is about the walking aspect of the accelerometer data, and whether or not you use that specifically to look at anything like stride assessment or energetics or frequency or distance or anything like that when they walk. And also just to comment on the difficulty of the when animals don't move for prolonged periods, because I study koalas and I feel your pain there.
Yeah, so I love to be able to look at the relationship between heart rate and speed. The problem is that we've movement. The problem is that we didn't have the ACC turned on the heart rate birds. The reason because the ACC interferes with the GPS, and we wanted to prioritize position because we're looking at relative position of group members, and so it's really important to have those data rather than the sort of activity data of what they're doing. They tend to all do the same thing at the same time, these birds. So yeah, it's something that I think would be really interesting to do. For example, to actually test whether ODBA or VDBA relates to heart rate and so on. And I haven't looked at stride length. Actually, that's a really interesting question. I never thought about it. So I'm sorry I don't have answers to your questions.
No worries. I'll stay tuned anyway. Thanks.
Graham, you have a question? I don't think I can't seem to hear you. Is it just me?
No, I couldn't hear it either.
If you type it in the chat, Graham, I'll read it out for you if you want. But we seem to have a problem with your audio. We'll try to come back. Matthew.
Yeah, hi. I'm just a sort of a technical question, really. You're talking about the energy costs for your equipment of various features, the GPS and the accelerometer and the actual download cost. I was wondering, did EOBS were they actually able to give you good guidance on how much those things cost in terms of power usage?
Yeah. Yep. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, because I've been working with MILSA stuff, and well, Pavel was not very helpful in that regard. I had to work it all out myself, basically, and it just trial and error. So I was just wondering if you got better service on that sort of stuff from EOBS. Yeah,
they have they have, what do they call it, a cost calculator or an energy calculator or something like that. So they basically have like a spreadsheet, and you put in your sampling, parameters, like how you're programming the tag, how you plan to program the tag, and it tells you how long the tag will last for, and so on. So with the heart rate, for example, we could find a nice balance between collecting data for over many months. So we collected data for 8 or 9 months, and also having like fine enough scale data. So that's why we went for like a 6-second window every 20 seconds. So it's a bit more than a third of the time, about a third of the time we had heart rate data, and we collected every 4th day, so that we're trying to capture a range of different conditions and so on. But we could do all that because we could get an estimate. They told us, plus or minus a month or so, but they told us when the tags should run out of power, and pretty much they were right.
Right. Yeah. So yeah,
now?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you can. Oh, right. It's all right.
Were you finished with your question, Matthew, or just?
Oh, yeah. Just
left?
I mean, yeah. I've actually been trying to find out more about their heart rate loggers, and I wasn't actually even aware of them having heart rate loggers until I saw your paper. So
so they made them in the past, and they had a bunch of the machinery left, and they produced those especially for me.
Okay.
But it was so successful, I think other people have asked them, that they've been asking me if we wanted them again, because they're thinking about doing another run of them. And they're pretty chunky. That's the biggest downside to them.
Oh, okay.
But they're super good quality. The data is brilliant.
Yeah.
So I would contact them if you're interested, because it's definitely on their radar to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to go there again, but we've used the Star Oddity ones, which of course don't have remote download, but they were very reliable.
Well, the good thing about the EOBS ones is we just get the raw signal, right? So it's not like we get a number, because I think the Star Oddity ones just give you like a heart rate number. We actually
can do both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we get the raw signal, and then I was able to write some scripts to extract quite cleanly the heart rate from that.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. All right, so we'll give Graham the last question just in the interest of time, and then we'll do a quick wrap up and talk about what's in the next meeting. So over to you, Graham.
Okay, well, I've adjusted my microphone, so hopefully you can hear me. Yes? Oh, good one. Well, a couple of comments. First of all, Damien, thank you. Very interesting talk. And the second comment is it brings back memories for me. It was about 4 decades ago. I was sticking radio transmitters on the backs of birds here in Australia, and it was very different technology then. So it's come a long way, which is great to see. My question is, have you been looking at what I call patterns of movement? And this reflects my own personal bias, being very interested in patterns of movement for some time. By patterns of movement, I mean, if you divide up a movement into segments with lengths of segments and correlated directions between successive segments, what do you see when you look at that across the different seasons, the different conditions, the different birds, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, Graham, I have to say that I still read many of your papers from back then. They're always very inspirational to me. And very good question. We haven't looked at that. We have all the data, and we definitely have a depth of data that we could do that. So any students want to get in on this, I'd be more than happy to work with people. I have a postdoc who was meant to be looking at, trying to use these data to look at some optimal foraging questions, but we haven't quite got there yet. But it's something I think about quite a lot as well, largely inspired by your work.
Well, I look forward to hearing, reading, seeing more about it, particularly in the context of optimal foraging, which is very close to my heart.
Yeah, me too. I think it's fantastic.
Great, thanks, Graham. All right, well, let's thank Damien again. And yeah, so thanks for coming to speak.